Welcome to Conlangery, the podcast about constructed languages and the people who create them. I'm George Corley, and with me in Los Angeles, California, we have Professor Emeritus of the University of Southern California and the creator of Natvy and Barsoomian, Paul Frommer.
Got it, my Elon. Hi, everybody. How you doing?
And of course, everyone understands why Paul is on here, but it's really exciting to have you on because, Avatar was like a very important event for like conlangers because, I mean, before that, I actually want to check here because before that, I think the only major motion pictures that were really big in the zeitgeist that had conlangs in them were Star Trek with Klingon, and it was sort of, it's still considered sort of nerdy and geeky and like a ways away, but a ways away from the mainstream. But I think Avatar brought it more. And the thing that I remember when Avatar was coming out was that the Natvy was actually talked about on Language Log, which is a popular linguistics blog. So it was getting some attention from academic linguists in a way that conlangs didn't necessarily get. So I want to ask you, when you started constructing Natvy, you were a professor already at that time?
I was a professor, but interestingly enough, not in the linguistics department. So I actually have a PhD in linguistics from USC, University of Southern California, which I got in 1981. But then actually I didn't go into linguistics professionally at that time. I decided I wanted to see what the business world was like. And so I had a sojourn at a Los Angeles corporation for over 10 years. I became a vice president. And then back in 1995, I had the opportunity to come back to the university, and I discovered that there was such a thing as business communication. And so I figured, linguistics sure sounds like communication, and I do have this experience in business. So I had an interview with the chair of the department at USC and convinced him that I knew something about the subject. And so I joined the faculty of the Department of Business Communication. At various times, it's also been called the Center for Management Communication. And I wound up mostly teaching writing. The course I specialized in was called Advanced Writing for Business, which actually was a pretty good fit for me. And so I was pretty happy there. And in 2005, I actually became chair of my department. And so that was a very eventful year for me, because that was also the year that this email was forwarded to me by a friend and colleague in the linguistics department, Ed Finegan, who actually was a professor of mine and turned out to be a co-author of mine. And the email was from James Cameron's production company, looking for a linguist who could create a language for a science fiction film. At the time, we didn't know anything about Avatar. It was codenamed Project 880 for some reason. So, So Ed looked at the email and said, this sounds like Paul. Because the two of us had worked together on a linguistics workbook. It's called Looking at Languages. It was pretty successful. It went into 6 editions. And it's essentially a problem book for students in an introductory linguistics course. I mean, I don't have to tell you, linguistics is kind of like math in the sense that you can't just read about it. You have to do it. You have to actually play with data and solve problems and so on. So it was an awful lot of fun to put together problems in about 30 different languages in phonology and syntax and morphology and semantics and so on. As it turns out, one of those problems that I had constructed was actually based on Klingon. I had learned just enough Klingon to be able to construct a syntax problem with Klingon data for undergraduate linguistics students. And so this already existed in this book, which was a physical object. And so when I saw the email, I said, I really want to do this. And I essentially applied for the job. And I wrote a very enthusiastic letter to James Cameron's production company explaining who I was and sending them a copy of the book. I also had a little bit of artificial data in the historical linguistics chapter of the book. It was a problem in comparative reconstruction. I came up with data in the speak to me family, which was kind of good, but it was hardly a complete Conlang. Anyway, I was contacted in a week or 10 days, said, why don't you come in and talk to Jim? So I wound up having this absolutely extraordinary hour and a half in James Cameron's office, just the two of us, talking for 90 minutes about his vision for the film and what he was looking for in the language and so on and so forth. And it went pretty well. And at the end of it, we stood up, shook hands, and he said, welcome aboard. So that was how I became involved in Avatar. It was pretty wild. And something totally, although I think I had a pretty good background for it, and it was something I really wanted to do. In a sense, it was totally serendipitous. It just kind of fell into my lap. If Ed Finegan had not forwarded me this email, I would never be here right now. So it worked out well.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's how it tends to go in show business stuff, right? You have to have some connection. But that's really interesting, the way that you got the job and the way that it worked out. So like you're in a communications department. But like how did like colleagues react to you like going in and doing this?
Colleagues in my department, which was a business communications department, were fascinated by it. And I mean, as long as it didn't interfere with my day job, so to speak, right? Because I remained chair of my department, and during those crucial years, from 1995 through 1998, I still was chair of my department, chair of an academic department at a major university, and had a lot of responsibilities. Interestingly, at the time, there didn't seem to be a lot of interest from the linguistics department, because I think things have changed. Okay, Avatar came out the first film came out in 2009, and Conlanging, at least in terms of academic linguistics, was a little bit like Roger Dangerfield, right? It didn't get no respect. People, I think, considered it frivolous and unacademic and something that they would never put on their resume. And so there was a bit of a supercilious attitude towards it. But I think things have changed. I mean, remarkably, I'm sure you're aware of this, there are now valid academic courses in real linguistics departments at very good universities in constructed languages. I mean, I've now spoken to Angela Carpenter's class. She's a linguist at Wellesley, and she's been giving a class now in constructed languages for quite a few years, and it's one of the most, if not the most popular course in the linguistics department, one of the most popular courses in the entire university. There's also always a long wait list, and part of the task of students in this course is to actually come up with their own conlang. I don't know how far they have to get, but at the end of the course, they have to do a presentation to the class on their conlang, and present the data. So I mean, I think Academically, it's become much more of a respected thing.
Yeah. I mean, I have seen that too. I remember within the community people talking about how they'd have negative reactions even from linguists when they were talking about from academic linguists, even if they are in academia themselves, about having a hobby of conlanging.
Uh-huh.
And when I was in grad school, most people were just like interested in what I was doing and the fact that I did this as a hobby. Maybe some people weren't like super into it,
Yeah.
but like some older professors weren't like into it, but people didn't really have negative reactions anymore, I think. Like 2005, I want to know, like, how aware were you of like the online conlanging community, and how did that? Because I know that now you are sort of connected a little bit more to like the broader conlanging community
Yeah.
too. You gave a talk at CopyCon.
Mm-hmm.
You've you know you've had events with David Peterson, and he's came out of the conlanging community. So, like, how did your connection develop with that, and were you aware of it before Avatar?
Yeah. I mean, in a word, I was totally unaware of it. I mean, I was really not a conlanger prior to Navi. Uh, I I had thought about what it would be like to construct a language, but I had never actually done it, and I was unaware of the existing conlanging community. Now, since then, of course, I've developed relationships. I know David pretty well. I know Mark Okran pretty well. I know Christine Schreier pretty well, and
Yeah.
these are wonderful people, and there are people in the conlanging community who really have become genuinely close friends, and that's something that's an added plus for me. Mark, David, and I are sometimes invited as a trio to kind of speak together as a panel. We did that twice, I think, at UCSD, University of California, San Diego. We were up in Calgary at some point. So yeah, uh, those connections are things that developed along the way. But it's been fascinating, and it's also been fascinating for me to learn what is one of the most interesting hobbies or interests, I guess, among people who are interested in language. Uh, and also, you're probably, I hope you're aware of the documentary film that Britton Watkins did, Conlanging, the Art of
Yes.
Crafting Tongues. Full disclosure, I'm an associate producer on the film. So is David, so is Mark. And we all really enjoyed taking part of that. And one of the wonderful things about that film is that although it talks about the professional conlangers like me and David and Mark, uh, it really concentrates on the part of the iceberg that's much more massive and below the surface, the people who were doing it out of sheer love, not necessarily getting compensation for it, but just doing extraordinarily creative things and beautiful things with conlanging. So it's becoming more of a thing, and that's a good thing. Yeah.
Yeah. By the way, if people who are watching this have not seen that documentary, go search for it. I have interviewed Britton Watkins back. That's in the audio episodes or in the audio archives of the show, and I was interviewed for the Conlanging documentary, but I didn't make the cut for the feature except for like a brief like splash of showing me recording the podcast.
Uh-huh.
But I was in the special features. But
Cool.
Anyway, not about me. This episode's not about me. It's about you. In terms of so you've you've grown more connected to the community. Another thing I want to talk about is like these conlangs for big film properties, have developed their own communities. And Na'vi, the interesting thing about Na'vi is like Mark Okrand wrote books about Klingon, and David has like done all kinds of like posts on social media, and he's done a little bit of documentation of some of the languages.
Mm-hmm.
For Na'vi, I think the first documentation was like fans reverse engineering, right?
There was something which was totally astonishing to me. So the first Avatar film opened. I forget the exact day. It opened on a Friday in December, and a few days prior to that, I get an email, a long email written entirely in Na'vi. And as you might imagine, it blew me away because I said, "Where in the world did this come from?" And it was pretty darn good. It wasn't 100% perfect, but it was remarkably good. Well, it turns out this came from Britain, and I don't recall if he worked independently or he worked with some other people, but there had been there was a certain amount of information which could be put together from things that had already appeared online. So, for example, I had done this interview for language. What was the name of that? Okay, I'm blanking on the name now, but a certain amount of information about the structure and about the phonology and so on had already appeared, and crucially, an incomplete and error-filled glossary had been leaked online. I don't know where that came from.
Oh,
but it was something like about 500 items, which people somehow had gotten access to. And so putting all this together from what I had said and from what you could find in various interviews that I had done with the glossary, people were able to deconstruct a fair amount. I mean, not everything, but a fair amount about the language. Mm-hmm. And so since then, of course, there's been a lot of documentation. And some of the things that people have done in the fan community are really remarkable. There are a couple of extraordinary dictionaries, the most extraordinary of which is called an Annotated Dictionary of Na'vi. It's put together by a German fellow named Stefan Müller. And it looks like something that comes from Oxford University Press. I mean, it's utterly professional. And every entry not only has what you might expect, the definitions and the transcriptions and IPA and all sorts of information about morphology and such, but it also has examples, canonical examples from just about everything that has appeared, from the movies themselves, from my blog, and from other reliable sources, to show how a particular lexical item is used in a sentence. And it's extraordinarily useful. I turn to it literally every single time that I'm thinking about Na'vi. So, I mean, the fact that people have put together this kind of stuff really, out of the sheer love of it, is just extraordinary to me. It's just a tremendous honor.
Oh, so you use fan-created materials, like as part of, like, if you're looking at, I don't know, there's all the sequels are in production or whatever. Yeah.
Well, I mean, if I want to remind myself how I've used a particular word, okay, a shorthand way of doing, an easy way of doing that is to go to the annotated dictionary, look up the word, and look at the example. Right. Now, the example came from me,
of course,
but
they compiled.
But they've compiled it, and so I mean, it's really quite remarkable. Yeah.
That's really amazing. I wish I could have people keep track of my notes of my languages for me.
Yeah, yeah,
That would be
yeah,
that would be an excellent. But I mean, and that's the kind of thing that you have to have if you have a real language is like databases of examples
yeah,
in order to go back on it and make sure that you're being consistent.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
yeah,
I mean, consistency is obviously a very big issue, especially for a language that's been around this long. Yeah, and
right.
I have an active fan base who are sometimes very on top of things. And I mean, my blog's been going for quite a few years now. And to be perfectly honest, there are times when I will make a pronouncement on the blog and someone will write in the comments very politely and respectfully. Uh, they would say, Código Paul, which is my title that they gave me. It's called Teacher Paul. They say, well, last week you said that this word is used in this particular structure, but back in 2012, you said it should go in that direction. Okay. And so I have to sometimes say, oh dear. Okay. So what do I do now? So I mean, there are times when I can kind of save it and say, okay, well, the thing is you have to look at the context because actually the two contexts are a little bit different. And it's perfectly legitimate to have it go this way in this context, this syntactic
Right.
environment, and that way in that context. Or I can say, yeah, well, that was early Navi back in 2012, and we've since learned more about the language, and so now it's this way. So there are ways to get around it, but this is just to say that consistency is crucial, and all this stuff exists and is canon and has to mesh with whatever has been done.
Yeah. Now, for The Shape of Water,
Uh-huh.
I think I remember reading that you created a separate, a different dialect of Na'vi, but not a separate language for the other clan, right?
Yeah. And so again, this was a direction that I got from James Cameron, saying that there's going to be actually a different, even physiological type of Na'vi, because the reef people look a little bit different from the forest people that we met in the original film. The coloring is a little different. They have webbing on their feet and so on, and they do speak a different dialect of Na'vi. Now, it's not a different language because, according to the storyline of the film, the forest people and the reef people can communicate with no problem. And so it had to be essentially, you might say, parallel to the differences between British and American English, that kind of thing. So I looked at all the sub-modules, you might say, of language, the phonetics and phonology, the morphology, the syntax, and so on. The most striking differences are in the phonology, because there are times in Reef Na'vi, so it's now Reef Na'vi, which is a new dialect, and Forest Na'vi, which is the original dialect that we heard. So there are a number of phonological differences. One is that the adjectives, which have gotten so much attention, the and those are realized in certain linguistic environments, certain positions in a word, in Reef Na'vi as voiced stops. So there are times when in Forest Na'vi comes out as a b in Reef, and so on. It's a very surfacey kind of phenomenon because there are reasons to think that underlyingly the objectives are still there, but if you want to think of rule ordering, which is an old-fashioned way to think of it, this comes very late in the derivation, so to speak. So that's one difference. Another difference is that the difference in the vowel system. So the vowel system of the original Na'vi dialect is somewhat asymmetrical. It's a 7-vowel system. And there's a distinction between the high front vowels. And so there's a tense lax distinction. There's E versus I. Okay. just as we have in English, seat versus sit and so on. But there's no parallel distinction in the high back vowels. There's no u versus
Okay.
Well, it turns out that in Nami there is that distinction. So they have an 8 vowel system. And the u and which apparently come from, where the assumption is they come from a parent language. In forest Navi, those have merged. But in reef Navi, they've remained distinct. And so this means that if you speak forest Navi and you want to try to speak the reef dialect, then you have to actually know for every lexical item, is the u in my dialect u or in reef Navi? So what I had to do is I had to go through essentially the entire vocabulary and look at every word that had a u and determine if it was going to be u or The notation for is a u with a grave accent. So
yeah,
that was kind of.
I was going to ask you like how you did that. Did you just go and just decide word by word? Because like it's like in sort of in vogue right now for conlangers to like do historical linguistic stuff, but it's easier to start from a proto language and then do the evolution in two directions. Right. But then you had to like reverse engineer what the protoform was.
Exactly. So, I mean, essentially, yeah, I did have to decide kind of on a word by word basis, but there were some guidelines too. So, the lax version, the does not appear word finally. Now, that's not true with the front vowels, because for the front vowels, the high front vowels, you can have both tense and lax vowels at the end of a word, or like, for example, we have a contrast between me and me. Those are two different words in Navi, but there's no parallel contrast between, say, something like lu and l at the end of a word. Okay. So that was one sort of shortcut. I knew that if a u would came at the end of a word, it has to be one variety and not the other. But I also didn't want it to be predictable. I didn't want people to think that, if it's a word with one syllable and it's u in a closed syllable, then it's always No. So there are contrasts between those two. So yeah, so it's not predictable, and in fact, you have to give special attention to every lexical item.
Yeah. You did want it to be a historical phonemic distinction. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So it is definitely a phonemic distinction in reef Navi. And of course, going from a distinction to a merger is easy. Going from a merger to a distinction is much harder, because then you have to know, is this merger in my language, which direction does it go in the language where they're distinct? And so that's right. But I mean, nevertheless, at least up to now, we've been focusing more on the forest dialect, which is the one that people are most familiar with. Now, there are lexical differences too. There are certain words that are used in one more than in the other. There's certain vocabulary items that are specific to one dialect and another, and that's still in the process of being developed. So,
now there is there was someone else did the sign language for Shape of Water.
Yeah.
Correct. Uh-huh. Did you have any involvement in that, or was that just a totally separate project?
That was a totally separate project. Yeah. Guy is great, and we got along well together, CJ. But we didn't have any contact, and that was deliberate on the part of James Cameron. He didn't feel that there needed to be a connection, and there wasn't. So he kind of went in his own direction.
Okay. All right. That's interesting.
Yeah.
So you did Navi, and I'm sure you're going to continue doing Navi for however many sequels James Cameron can fund.
And video games. And there's a big video game
Yeah.
That's coming out at the end of this year, which has some of the language in it. So that's been fun to work on too. Yeah.
Yeah. Have you've been working on translation? Have you worked with the voice actors for the video
Oh
game
yeah,
at all?
very much so.
Oh, good. Okay. Um, you also did the Barsoomian language for the John Carter movie.
I did.
Which I saw. There wasn't a whole lot of Barsoomian in it.
No. There was not a whole lot of Barsoom in it. That was a very different kind of assignment because,
Right.
for one thing, of course, there's a series of, I think, 7 novels by Edgar Rice Burroughs in the Barsoom series. And he had come up with about 400 vocabulary items, right? And he had, yeah. So those already existed. I did not have to read all 7 novels. In fact, what was a tremendously useful time saver was this. There is this book, Guide to Barsoom. It's an encyclopedia of Barsoom, and John Flint Roy was the extraordinarily dedicated compiler of all this information about the whole series, and just about every word in the books is in that little encyclopedia. So that was a very useful resource. But the thing is, there were words, but there was no syntax whatsoever. There was precisely one sentence, which consisted of one word, sock, which meant jump. That was it. So that meant that.
But that means you have an idea of what an imperative can look
like. There
right?
You go. Right. That was it. So the syntax and the phonology was completely up to me. Now, one big guiding principle for that was that, according to the first novel, I actually read at least the first 2 in the series. John Carter says that the Martian language was so easy that I think in a matter of a week he was able to express himself with no problem and understand it. I mean, look, no language is that easy, but that told me that, don't make it a complicated syntax. Don't make it really, really simple. And so that was sort of a time saver too. What I had to do was kind of look at the words, which, and there are no recordings. I don't know how they're supposed to sound, and figure out exactly what he was talking about. So, for example, if you see a CH, okay, well, it could be ch, but it could also be sh as in machine, or it could be k as in chorus, or it could be ch as in Bach. So what exactly does he mean by CH? So I had to make all these decisions along the way. But it turned out okay. I mean, it's been a long time. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Was the what I want to ask is, like, was it clear that there could be a consistent pattern out of the words, or were they kind of haphazard?
No,
and you had to do a lot of stuff.
There was really no consistent pattern. But I mean, Edgar Rice Burroughs was not a linguist, right? And he came up with very Englishy kind of stuff, things that English speakers would have no problem pronouncing. And there's some cliches, so there's an awful lot of th. There's Thora, that kind of thing, which he must have thought sounded exotic or something. I don't know. But that wasn't too difficult to put together in a consistent way. I really only went as far as the needs of the movie. So I didn't really expand the vocabulary. And since I think it's fair to say that the film was not a huge success, and there weren't going to be any sequels, I really didn't do too much more with it.
Yeah. When you say that, I do have to say, like, my gripe with that movie was they actually set up John Carter as a guy who learns languages, because he speaks, I don't know an indigenous language in the beginning. What is it, like Blackfoot or something?
Yeah, you're right. There is something in there.
Yeah.
I forget which
And then
language it is. Yeah.
yeah, but then instead of utilizing the language you made, they have it for a few lines at the beginning, and then he drinks this magic juice, and he automatically it's all in English.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a strong tendency among directors and producers to feel that a lot of the intended audience doesn't want to read subtitles, and they really want to hear
Right.
their own language. I did do another language, which you're probably not aware of. Are
Oh,
you aware of a movie for? I guess the audience was basically what are they called? Tweens. It was called Aliens in the Attic. Are you familiar with that?
I think I've heard the name, but I haven't seen it.
So I actually saw it on cable just about a week ago or so. I hadn't seen it in a long time. So it's a very lighthearted sort of comedy aimed at a very teenage audience. And the premise is that I think four little aliens land on a rooftop of a house in Maine, and they're about to take over the planet. And the human race is rescued by this bunch of teenagers. Okay, so
Right.
that's kind of the premise. But since they are aliens, it was thought that they have to have their own language, and so I got the gig, and I developed. Actually, I thought it was kind of a nice language for them, and we went as far as working with voice actors, and they they hired some very. I should mention these were CGI aliens, and so there weren't any
Right.
actual actors, but you still had to have voice actors to voice the language, and it was kind of fun. It was going well. I remember meetings with the writers and director to see exactly what the language should sound like, and it shouldn't. They didn't want it to sound too much like one language, one human language, or another, because they thought that there might be some negative feedback about that. So we settled on what the language should sound like, and so on and so forth. Anyway, uh, then the stuff was done. I was actually on set for the actual shootings. I don't even remember. But my point is, my job was done. They said thank you. They sent me a check, and that was it. So the movie actually came out, and I said to myself, I should go see the movie. So I did,
Right.
and I went during the day on a weekday, and it was playing in a local theater. And I remember there were five people in the audience. There was a father and a young child, another father and another young child, and me. So the three of us, the five of us are in the theater, and the movie's starting. And I'm waiting for the aliens to land, and I'm waiting to hear my language. And so the aliens land, and they immediately speak English. There wasn't one word of the language that I had come up with left in the movie. So I mean, although no one had contacted me, it was very clear that uh, after I was involved, someone made the decision. Probably our intended audience is not going to want to read subtitles, and so they decided everything should be in English. It was kind of too bad.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean, that's movie making. They make decisions at the last
sure.
minute or
Yeah,
at any point in time. So for some reason, they just decided they would scrap the language.
yeah.
That's unfortunate, but it happens. It's interesting to me. Like, you are at like one point in this timeline of Conlang's becoming more popular. Going back to like Avatar, you had, you had Klingon was like the first big movie Conlang. There were some before that. There was like Land of the Lost
Mhm.
and all that, and then we have a few smaller projects, and you have Avatar, and then not too long after that, Avatar is 2009, right?
Yeah.
And then not too long after that, you have Game of Thrones, and then it starts to get into a pattern of more and more properties are getting these proper conlangs. Like, how do you view your place in that, and have you seen, since you've gotten in it, how have you seen things changing in terms of conlangs getting incorporated in these properties?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's become pretty clear that if there's going to be any sort of alien race speaking a language, it can't just be gibberish. I think that was probably true ever since Klingon, that people are going to expect it to be a well-constructed, linguistically valid, viable language. And so at this point, I think producers and directors know that that if there's going to be any sort of alien speech, you've got to hire someone who knows what he or she is doing. And so
Right.
there are gigs that open up. Inevitably, I think if it's a major property, producers and directors are going to go with a known quantity if they can. And so there are but I mean, this is true not only in conlanging but true in the world in general, right? I mean, track records mean something and connections mean something, but there are still opportunities. I mean, the Language Creation Society, of course, has a job board, job listing, and I think some people have become aware of that. And I guess hopefully there are more opportunities for people to actually get jobs that make use of their creativity and actually get some compensation for it. Thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's definitely a good thing. And, I have seen conlangers getting jobs out of the jobs board. Join the Language Creation Society if you want to have access to those jobs early enough to actually apply for them, because they go quick. It's pretty competitive because there's a lot of people who want to do that. And it's sort of a fight to make sure that to direct people through the jobs board so that the jobs board can negotiate decent pay for these projects, right, too, because so do you still get contacted for projects?
Yeah.
Are you are you thinking that you would?
Yeah, on occasion someone will contact me, and if it's something that sounds like it would be interesting and something that would fit into my schedule and something that I would enjoy doing, then I might accept it. Or I might say, I really appreciate it, but right now my plate's kind of full. And then I will direct it elsewhere. Right. I have directed people to the jobs board of the Constructed Language Association, the CSA. There are other times when I know of someone who I think would do a particularly good job at that particular project, and I will personally recommend someone like that. There are a number of things that I was contacted about. I have been contacted about, which sounded interesting, and actually did a fair amount of preliminary work on it, and then they kind of fell through. But that's also that's typical too. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. What can be a little irksome in those sort of situations is that I've encountered situations where people have presented a project to me. It sounds very interesting, and they will send me all sorts of preliminary material for me to look at and read, get involved in, and then there are sometimes a lot of extensive conversations online and actually conferences and phone calls and so on. And you wind up putting in a fair amount of work for this. And then, all of a sudden, you discover sometimes just from reading the newspaper, that the project has been abandoned. It did not get green lighted and is not going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
And you never hear from these people again. Now, I must say, that has not been my experience with the Avatar people at all. They're extraordinarily considerate, and I consider myself very lucky about that.
Yeah.
But it's a little bit strange just in terms of interpersonal reaction to have put in a fair amount of work and talked to a lot of people and doing a lot of research for a project, and then all of a sudden, as soon as the project is a no-go, you never hear from these people again. It's I don't know how to. I have a feeling this may be fairly typical. So it's just something that I think you have to sort of develop a thick skin about. Because if it were me, I would kind of expect people to say, "Hey, Paul, just want to let you know, for these various reasons, unfortunately, the project's not going to happen. But we really appreciate the time that you put in, and thanks very much. And hopefully, we'll be able to connect at some point in the future." That's sort of a human thing to do, right? Yeah, because typically you put in all this work and there's been no compensation at that point at all. Fine, okay, but at least say thanks. But just for people to sort of ghost you at that point because there's no more funding for the project just seems a little weird. Maybe I'm being old-fashioned about that.
Yeah, I mean, no, I totally agree with you, and that's something that happens all over the place.
Yeah.
In terms of like business relations, I think part of that is like the landscape of TV and movies that we're in right now. Shows get canceled just like immediately, or just like very suddenly get canceled. And like there may not be somebody who left who has the responsibility of contacting you.
Right, true.
Because the whole team is dissolved, and like I don't know, conlangers end up in weird departments. I think David was contacted by a video game sound director at one point. It's like, I don't know if that's exactly the right person for the conlanger to be talking to.
Yeah. No, you definitely have a point, and it's often that there may not be one particular person who has a responsibility. But if it's someone that you've been speaking to on a regular basis, and they have the information that it's not going to go, then give the guy a call. That's all. Yeah. I'm just a little bit. I mean, it's not that big a deal. Anyway.
Yeah. Well, that's really interesting to see that you're still going and still, accepting projects here and there and such. And I'm sure you're still going to be working on Avatar.
I hope so. There are 3 more sequels that are scheduled.
Wow.
Yeah. So the first sequel, they've been kind of codenamed A1 through A5. So A1 was the original movie in 2009, and The Way of Water is A2. So 3, 4, and 5 have been scheduled. 3 is coming out at the end of 2025. And then I forget the actual schedule for the next 2. But I will be even longer in the tooth than I am right now, but hopefully I'll still be around. Hopefully I'll still be involved. So,
the movie series has like a set number that I think James Cameron managed to fund up front because he's James Cameron, I guess. But if it continues beyond that, could you see yourself eventually handing it off to people who have learned not V as fans and stuff?
Yeah, at some point it will be handed off to somebody. Yeah, and exactly how that's going to happen is not entirely clear. But I'm it's no secret I just turned 79. I have to be 80 next year. And so at some point, I'm probably going to say, I think it's time to maybe turn it over to somebody, and
Right.
that'll happen at that point. But what's remarkable is that there are a lot of people, and I'm not going to say hundreds of people, but there's a fairly decent group of people who have embraced the language to the point where I could say they know it as well as I do. Now I'm still the gatekeeper. I'm still the only one who can say, okay, this new vocabulary item is an official part of the language, or it's not. But there are people who are really using it in very creative ways. I mean, not just emails and text, but stories and poems and songs. It's really been very, very gratifying.
Well, that's great. That's really exciting to think about. This can keep on going and going. And it's been great talking to you. Do you have any final thoughts for our listeners? Most of our listeners are conlangers.
Yeah.
Some of them might want to do it professionally. A lot of them might want to just continue doing it for themselves. But do you have any advice, anything that you would like to share with them before we go?
Well, I mean, first of all, I mean, it's one of the great joys, I think, in the lives of people who love language, to be able to actually create something of your own. I guess the biggest piece of advice would be learn as much linguistics as you can. Really delve into how language works, how language functions, and in particular, how languages differ from one to another. Because I think inevitably what happens is that either consciously or unconsciously, you wind up thinking about the languages that you know and using structures that occur in the languages that you know. And so getting your hands wet, so to speak, in a lot of different natural languages, so that you can get a sense of the different ways that language can handle various linguistic tasks, right, is an extremely useful thing. So, if you're someone who is interested in conlanging and has studied Spanish and maybe has studied French, that's fantastic. But you have to realize that when you study languages that are closely related, chances are they're going to do a lot of things in related ways. But in addition to Spanish and French and Italian and Portuguese, which are fantastic languages, how about Mandarin? How about a Native American language? How about Thai or something like that? Those will give you more of a range or more of a sense of the very, very interesting things that languages can do. The part of linguistics that wound up interesting me the most is typology. And I actually did a dissertation and I was extraordinarily fortunate in having as my dissertation advisor one of the world's greatest typologists, Bernard Comrie. And just the idea of looking at languages and what could be a possible language and what is a probable language. Just want to point out this book, which is really quite a wonderful resource. Possible and Probable Languages by Fritz Newmeyer, who actually I have a connection to him because we were both in the same undergraduate class at the University of Rochester, New York, class of 1965. What's very interesting about this is that in the early part of the book, he has lists of seemingly universal or universally non-occurring features of language. In other words, looking at natural languages, what are some things that every natural language does or no natural language can do? Okay, and when you know that kind of stuff, when you get a sense of what's possible and what's probable, then you can kind of think about what you want your language to be. Do you want it to be a very natural, Earth-like language, easily learnable by humans, or is it going to be an alien language that's going to do things that no human language has ever done? and no humans could ever learn. So once you get a sense of that, then you have a, you can kind of think about what you want your language to be and make it as wonderful and weird and creative as possible.
Well, so you have thank you for that book recommendation, by the way. I will go and see if I can get that one. But you have hit on the two things that I also tell conlangers to study is typology and then just grammars of lots of different languages, and as broad ranging as you can get, major languages like Spanish, French, Chinese, whatever, and also, Australian Aboriginal languages, Native American languages, South American languages,
Exactly.
all of them. And whatever interests you, whatever you can get, study it. But it's been great having you on, Paul.
Thank you.
And thank you so much for your time. I'm really grateful to have had you on the show. And I will that you did you have something else?
Now, I just want to say it's been a pleasure talking to you, George. Thanks very much. And I wish you and your audience happy conlanging.
Special thanks to my patrons on Patreon. If you go over there right now, you can get early access to episodes. You can get access to scripts for my solo episodes, and you can go get access to exclusive polls for Tongues and Runes. Thank you to Mintaka, Connor Stewart Rowe, Kenan Kigunda, Jesse, Kay, Viren Patrick, Alexis Hugelman, Anthony Dosimo, Artifexian, Cassandra Woodhouse, Greca Grunk, Grammar Antifa, Eloivar Yana Mentulem, Jack Keynes, Jake Penny, Miles Ronkovich, Nicholas Norblad, Sigourney Hunter, Sylvia Sotomayor, Wuming Shuai. Conlangery's theme music is by Null Device. Conlangery is distributed under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial Share-alike 4.0 international license.